8:15 in the morning, August 6, 1945. Above the Japanese city of Hiroshima, a single B-29 bomber, named Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother, releases a single weapon. It falls for 43 seconds, and then the sky itself catches fire. Fire. By the time the smoke rises high enough to be seen from the sea, 70,000 human beings are already dead. The number will double before the year is out. President Truman will announce, in careful language from Washington, that the weapon carried the force of 20,000 tons of TNT. Modern calculations put the true figure closer to 15 kilotons. Both numbers lie beyond anything the human mind was built to hold. Somewhere in the Pacific that morning, a young American Marine on Okinawa is cleaning his rifle. He is preparing for the invasion of Japan that his commanders have told him will kill 1 million men. He does not know yet that he will live. He will not know for another 80 years that 7,000 miles away, in an English country house, wrapped in the slow gold of summer, 10 German scientists are eating breakfast. Men who tried for 6 years to build the very weapon that has just saved his life. They failed. They do not know about Hiroshima. Not yet. In 9 hours they will hear the BBC. And into microphones hidden inside the walls of the room where they are sitting, they will begin to say things that the British government will keep locked away for the next 47 years. This is the story of that evening, and the 6 years of silence that led to it. Godmanchester, England. 17 miles north of Cambridge. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The manor called Farm Hall sits behind a low stone wall, ivy crawling along the brick, roses drooping in the summer heat. From the road it looks like any other English country estate. A gardener trims a hedge he does not need to trim. A cat sleeps in the driveway. The light through the tall Georgian windows is the colour of old brass. Inside 10 men wait. They wear civilian clothes now. Wool trousers, buttoned shirts, jackets folded neatly over chairs. But their bodies still carry the discipline of the laboratory. The way a man stands when he has spent 30 years bent over a bench. The way a hand rests on the edge of a table, ready. Werner Heisenberg leans against a bookshelf. He is 43 years old. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics at 31. For 12 years he was, by common consent, one of the 3 or 4 greatest theoretical physicists alive. Now his fingers trace the spine of a book he has already read twice. Otto Hahn sits by the radio. He is 66. His hair has gone white during the war. He is a chemist, not a physicist. His wife, Edith, has suffered a nervous breakdown in the last winter of the fighting. His only son, Hanno, lost an arm on the Eastern Front. Hahn taps his pipe against the ashtray, the way a man taps his pipe when his hands need something to do. By the tall window stands Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. He is 33, the youngest of the group's central figures. His father was state secretary in the German Foreign Ministry, and is at this very moment being investigated for war crimes at Nuremberg. Weizsäcker watches birds he cannot name. His hands are clasped behind his back. Max von Laue, 65, Nobel laureate, opens a book of theology. He never worked on the atomic program. He opposed the regime for 12 years quietly, at great personal cost. He is the only man in this room who has nothing to hide. Walter Gerlach, 56, drinks something amber from a glass that is not his first of the day. He was the final coordinator of the German uranium program. He promised results he could not deliver. He knows this better than anyone. Kurt Diebner, 40, sits alone in the far corner. He joined the Nazi Party in 1939. He does not speak much. He knows what is coming when they finally send him home. The others move through the rooms without ceremony. Paul Hartek, 43. Karl Wirtz, 35. Eric Bagg, 33. Horst Korsching, 32. They have been here since the 3rd of July. 3 months. Long enough to memorize the pattern of light on the drawing room floor. Long enough to stop asking when they will be released. What none of them suspect. What not one of these 10 men has any reason to imagine. Hidden in the walls, beneath the tables, inside the light fixtures, tiny microphones, recording every word they speak, every argument, every silence, every moment of despair. To understand how these 10 men came to sit in an English drawing room waiting for news that would destroy them, We have to go back 7 years. To Berlin. To a laboratory bench at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry. To a December afternoon in 1938. Otto Hahn was 59 years old that winter. He had spent 3 decades bombarding heavy elements with neutrons, patient work, dull work, the work of a chemist, trying to understand what happens when the nucleus of an atom swallows a subatomic particle. That December, working alongside his younger colleague Fritz Strassmann, he found something that should not have been possible. He had bombarded uranium. He expected to find heavier elements in the wreckage. Instead, he found barium, a lighter element, almost half the size of uranium, as if the uranium nucleus itself had somehow split in two. Hahn was frightened. He wrote a letter that same night to a woman named Lise Meitner. Meitner was 60 years old, Austrian by birth, Jewish by ancestry. She had worked beside Hahn for 30 years at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. 5 months earlier, in the summer of 1938, she had fled Germany in secret. The Anschluss had stripped her of her Austrian citizenship and made her subject to the racial laws of the Reich. She had crossed the Dutch border with 10 marks in her purse and the clothes on her back. She read Hahn's letter in a small town in Sweden, on a walk through the snow with her nephew, Otto Frisch. She did the mathematics on the back of an envelope. She calculated the energy that would be released when a single uranium nucleus split apart. She gave the phenomenon its name, fission. She sent her calculations back to Hahn, and within months, physicists in every capital of the world understood what was possible. A single kilogram of uranium, if properly controlled, could release the energy of thousands of tons of high explosive. Germany in 1939 held every card in the deck. The discovery had been made on German soil. The best physicists in the world spoke German. The best laboratories in the world stood in Berlin, Leipzig, Hamburg, Munich. When war came in September, the German Army Weapons Office moved fast. They created a program to explore the military use of fission. They called it the WWII, the Uranium Club. They called Werner Heisenberg, and Heisenberg came. Within months, he was the scientific center of the German atomic program. And here is where history turns on the tip of a pencil. In 1940 and 41, Heisenberg sat down to calculate the critical mass of uranium-235, the minimum amount of the rare fissile isotope needed to sustain a chain reaction. The single most important number in the physics of a nuclear weapon. He got it wrong, not by a little, by orders of magnitude. Heisenberg believed the critical mass was measured in tons, not on the order of 50 kilograms, which was closer to the figure the Americans would arrive at in Los Alamos. Not 100 kilograms, tons, an amount so vast that no wartime industrial effort could hope to enrich it. His error was not arithmetic. It was methodological. He used a diffusion approximation, a mathematical model suited to a slow neutron reactor, not to a fast neutron bomb. And he never went back, never redid the calculation from first principles, never asked the question again in 6 years. Because of that single mistake, at a single blackboard in a single week in 1940, the WWII spent the entire war chasing the wrong problem. In June of 1942, at the Harnack House in Berlin-Dahlem, Heisenberg was called to a meeting. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, sat across from him at a long polished table. Speer asked in as many words whether Germany could build an atomic bomb. Heisenberg answered carefully, yes, in principle, not in this war, not within any timeline the war effort could accept. 3 to 5 years, at the earliest. Speer nodded. He redirected the funding to the V-2 rocket. He told Hitler that atomic weapons were a matter for the peace that would follow the war. It was the moment Germany lost the atomic race. Not on a battlefield, not in a bombing raid, at a conference table. On the strength of one man's mathematical error, made 2 years earlier and never corrected. The Americans were not making that error. By 1943, an American general named Leslie Groves was overseeing an industrial project that dwarfed anything the Germans had imagined. Cities in the desert, reactors on the Columbia River, enrichment plants at Oak Ridge that consumed as much electricity as a small nation, 130,000 workers, a budget of $2 billion, at a time when $2 billion was a fortune beyond calculation. And that same autumn, the Americans and the British created a special military unit. Its purpose was singular: find out how close Germany had come, capture the German scientists, seize their notes, their reactors, their equipment, make certain that no atomic secret survived the collapse of the Reich. They called it Alsos. Its military commander was a colonel named Boris Pash, 45 years old, the son of a Russian Orthodox archbishop who had emigrated after the Bolshevik Revolution. Pash had led the internal security investigation of J. Robert Oppenheimer at Berkeley. He was hard, methodical. He did not sleep much. Its scientific director was a physicist named Samuel Goudsmit, 43 years old, Dutch by birth, American by adoption. He had known most of the German scientists personally before the war. He had eaten dinner in their homes. He had corresponded with Heisenberg for a decade. On the 11th of February 1943, Samuel Goudsmit's parents, Isaac and Marianne, were murdered at Auschwitz. They were in their late 60s. They had spent the last months of their lives waiting for American visas that arrived too late. Goudsmit did not know the exact date for a long time. What he knew was that he had tried, and failed, to get them out of the Netherlands. He knew the German scientists had lived their comfortable wartime lives while his mother was put on a train. He carried that with him through every interrogation, through every captured document, through every conversation with men he had once called friends. November of 1944, Alsos entered Strasbourg. Samuel Goudsmit spent a single night in a captured German laboratory, reading Weizsäcker's abandoned files by lamplight. By morning, he understood something that the American High Command refused to believe. The Germans were not close. They had never been close. But the war was not over. The scientists were still out there. And through the spring of 1945, as the Reich collapsed, Alsos raced forward. They found the underground reactor at Haigerloch, built beneath a church, hidden in a cave carved out of rock. They found the reactor's 664 uranium cubes, most of them buried in a field nearby, wrapped in cloth, waiting for a chain reaction that would never come. They found Hahn's Institute at Tailfingen, Heisenberg's laboratories at Hechingen. And on the 3rd of May, 1945, 3 days before Germany surrendered, Colonel Boris Pash himself led the small team that climbed the mountain road above Urfeld in the Bavarian Alps. They arrested Werner Heisenberg at his family cabin. He came out into the light with his hands in his pockets. He did not resist. The others were gathered in turn: Otto Hahn at Tailfingen, Weizsäcker at Hechingen, Gerlach, Diebner, von Lauer, Hartek, Wurz, Bag, Korsching, 10 men in total. They were moved from place to place, first to Reims, then to the Château du Chesnay near Versailles, then to the Villa Argentina in Le Vésinet, then across the border to a house called Fatcaval in Huy, in Belgium. At each stop they were interrogated. At each stop they were told nothing about their fate. On the 3rd of July, 1945, they were flown to England. They were driven through countryside they could not identify. They were shown into a manor house with tall windows and comfortable rooms, and a walled garden. They were permitted to walk in. They did not know what building they were in. They did not know that they were 17 miles from Cambridge. They did not know that a British major named T.H. Rittner had spent weeks preparing the rooms. And they did not know what had been installed in the walls. A few days after their arrival at Farm Hall, Kurt Diebner sat with Werner Heisenberg in a corner of the drawing room. He kept his voice low. "Do you think they have microphones?" Heisenberg smiled. He was 43 years old. He was the most famous physicist in Germany. He had won the Nobel Prize. He had lectured to kings. "I don't think so," he said. "They're not that Gestapo-like. They're rather old-fashioned in that respect." In a small room elsewhere in the house, a team of British intelligence officers, all of whom spoke fluent German, sat in front of a bank of steel recording equipment. The tape reels turned. The needles moved. The words came in, one after another, and the transcription began. Every word Heisenberg had just spoken. Every word he was about to speak. For the next 6 months, in every room, in every corridor, in every whispered conversation before sleep. Microphones and 40 spools of tape would remember what 10 German scientists had said, and what they had chosen not to say, and what they had believed no one would ever hear. The British had a name for it, Operation Epsilon. And on the 6th of August 1945, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, in the last golden hour, before the BBC's evening news, the tape reels were already turning. They had already been turning for 35 days. They had 4 hours left to wait. Farm Hall had a rhythm. Breakfast at 8, real coffee, of a kind the men had not tasted in years, toast, marmalade in a small glass jar. The morning newspapers a day old, brought in by the British staff and read slowly. Second cups. Physics, until noon. Long walks in the walled garden between 2 tall hedges. Chess in the afternoon. Card games. Letters home that would be read, censored, and eventually delivered. For 3 months this was their world. Otto Hahn kept mostly to himself. He was 66 years old, and he looked older than that now. He wrote to his wife almost every day. Edith had suffered a nervous breakdown during the last winter of the war. His only son, Hanno, had lost an arm on the Eastern Front. Every day Hahn waited for letters that came slowly, when they came at all. He walked in the garden alone. He smoked his pipe on a bench by the roses. He said very little at meals. Heisenberg played the piano. He was very good. In the evenings, he would sit at the upright instrument in the drawing room, and he would play Beethoven, and the other men would gather without speaking. And for an hour, the war would seem like something that had happened to different people in a different country. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker read theology. He had begun the war as a physicist. He was ending it as something else. He walked the garden with his hands clasped behind his back. He thought about the future. He prepared his arguments. Walther Gerlach drank in the evenings. He was 56 years old. He had been the last coordinator of the WWII. He had promised results he could not deliver. He knew, better than any of them, how much they had failed. Kurt Diebner was quiet. He had joined the party in 1939. He knew what that would mean when the reckoning came. And so the days passed. The British officers who watched them made careful notes. The microphones ran. The tapes were changed and shipped to London for transcription. In a small office in a quiet corner of the estate, Major T.H. Rittner read every word. He was a careful man. A former businessman, recalled to service. He spoke fluent German. And in 3 months of listening, he had come to understand these 10 prisoners very well. Late in the afternoon of the 6th of August, 1945, a telephone call came in from London. Rittner took the call in his private office. He listened. He said very little. When it was finished, he stood at his desk for a long moment, with his hand still resting on the receiver. He had been given the news of Hiroshima. He had been given specific instructions. The instructions were these. Tell Otto Hahn first. Tell him alone. Watch him. British intelligence had been listening to Hahn for 3 months. They knew what fission had cost him privately. They knew that he was the man who had made the discovery. They believed, and they were probably correct, that Hahn was the most emotionally vulnerable of the 10 men in that house. There was concern at the highest levels that he might harm himself. Shortly before dinner, Rittner walked out of his office and found Hahn in the drawing room. He asked him, quietly, if he would step into a small parlour across the hall. They went in. Rittner closed the door. He asked Hahn to sit down. He told him that an American bomb, based on atomic fission, had been dropped that morning on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosive yield was being reported at approximately 20,000 tons of TNT. Casualties were expected to be in the tens of thousands. President Truman had said, in a statement from Washington, that the war in the Pacific would soon be over. Otto Hahn did not speak. He stared at the wall for a long moment. His hand was steady, in the way a man's hand is steady when he has stopped feeling his own body. Then he said, very quietly, into a microphone he did not know, was there. I feel personally responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. They sat together, the British officer and the German chemist, for perhaps 20 minutes. Hahn told him, in a voice that did not rise, That when he had first realized in 1939 what fission might one day make possible, he had considered taking his own life. He said it as a fact, not as a threat. Rittner made a note of it later in his official report. Hahn said too that he was glad that Germany had not built it, glad that the men in this house had failed. Then, Rittner made a decision. He would let Hahn be the one to break the news to the others at dinner. He believed, and he later wrote, that hearing it from a countryman would be less of a blow than hearing it from a British officer. They went in to dinner at 7:30. The table was set for 10. The men came down from their rooms and took their usual places. Soup, boiled potatoes, a pudding for dessert. Otto Hahn waited until they had begun to eat. Then, without preamble, in a voice that was almost too calm, he said, "Would you like to hear the news? The Americans have used an atomic bomb against Japan." For a moment, no one moved. Heisenberg set down his knife. "I don't believe it." Deibner said the same, in almost the same words, but with more force. Hahn nodded slowly. "We can listen at 9. The rest of the meal passed in a kind of numb ceremony. Nobody finished their food. Weizsäcker asked several careful questions about the wording of the announcement. Wirtz was pale. Bagg stared at the table. Only Max von Laue, who had never touched the atomic program, ate with something close to his normal appetite. He said very little. He watched the others. At 8:45, they gathered in the drawing room around the wooden cabinet radio. The 9 o'clock BBC News began. Lead story was Hiroshima. The announcer's voice, calm and precise, read the words of President Truman. An atomic bomb. The harnessing of the basic power of the universe. $2 billion in secret research. Facilities in New Mexico, in Tennessee, in Washington state. The largest scientific and industrial undertaking in the history of mankind. The room was completely silent while the broadcast played. When it ended, the silence continued for several more seconds. Heisenberg spoke first. His voice was defensive, almost angry. "I still don't believe it's an atomic bomb. Perhaps it's something with 10 times the effect of ordinary explosive, but not fission. The separation problem alone." Wirtz cut him off. His voice was flat. "I'm glad we didn't have it." Weizsäcker, more softly, "I think it is dreadful of the Americans to have done it. I think it is madness on their part." Hahn, who had been carrying the news for 3 hours already, said only, "They can never do it now." He meant the Nazis. He meant the regime that had already collapsed in April. He meant that whatever else had happened in the last 12 hours, the world would not be one where Hitler held this weapon. Then he was silent for a long time. Gerlach did not stay for the discussion. He stood up without a word. He walked out of the drawing room. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom and he shut the door behind him. He did not come down for the rest of the night. Later, one of the men would hear him weeping. Deibner sat forward with his hands laced together on his knees. His voice was low. "Could be a very high-level bluff. Psychological warfare. Make Japan surrender without invasion." Heisenberg jumped at the idea. Yes, that's possible. But even as they said it, the possibility drained out of the room. The BBC report had been too specific. The numbers were too consistent. The tone had been too controlled. This was not a bluff. This had happened. Later that night, alone in his room, Otto Hahn sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. He did not write in a journal. He did not pray. He simply sat, and after a while, he slept. While he slept, on the other side of the world, the sun was rising over the ruin of Hiroshima. By the earliest American estimates, 66,000 people were already dead. 69,000 more were injured, many of them dying. The final toll, when it was counted years later, would be far higher. In a Red Cross hospital that had been half flattened by the blast, surgeons were operating without anesthesia. In the streets outside, survivors were walking in silence toward the outskirts of the city, their skin hanging from their arms in strips. And in an English country house, 10 men had learned what 6 years of careful reassurance had hidden from them. They had lost. At breakfast on the 7th of August, Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker made a decision. He was 33 years old. His father was being tried at Nuremberg. He knew how history was written. He knew that history was written by whoever spoke first, and spoke with confidence. He set down his coffee cup. He looked around the table, and he began to construct the story. The microphones caught his words. They survive today in the transcripts, exactly as he spoke them. History will record, Weizsäcker said, that the Americans and the English made a bomb, and that at the same time, the Germans, under the Hitler regime, produced a workable engine. In other words, the peaceful development of the uranium engine took place in Germany, under the Hitler regime, whereas the Americans and the English developed this ghastly weapon of war. It was a beautiful sentence, balanced, symmetrical, almost noble. It was also a lie. Germany had not produced a workable engine. The reactor at Heigerloch had never gone critical. It had never sustained a chain reaction. The German program had failed at every level, at theoretical calculation, at industrial capacity, at priority, at will. Weizsäcker was not describing what had happened. He was describing what would need to be said in the coming months and years, if the men in that room were to walk out of the ruins of the Reich with their reputations intact. He was writing the first draft of what would come to be known in German as the Lesart. The reading, the version, the story that was chosen. The story was this: the German scientists could have built the bomb. They chose not to. Their choice was moral. The Americans built the bomb because Americans lacked German conscience. Hahn was the first to push back. He set down his fork. I don't believe that, but I am glad we didn't succeed. He said it flatly. He said it in a way that admitted everything. That they had not chosen. That they had failed. That the reason they were sitting alive in an English drawing room and not in the dock at Nuremberg was not moral. It was mathematical. The men in that room had chased the wrong problem for 6 years. Nobody at the table argued with Hahn. Nobody agreed with him either. Wirtz stirred his coffee. Weizsäcker went on eating. The moment passed, but something had begun. In the days that followed, around the edges of that breakfast table, in the walled garden, in the small parlour after dinner, the story would be tested and refined and rehearsed. By the time these 10 men returned to Germany, the Lesart would be ready. For the next 47 years, most of the world would believe it. Through the day of the 7th of August and into the 8th, Werner Heisenberg sat with paper and pencil in his room and tried to work out how the Americans had done it. He tried to reverse engineer the physics of a bomb from a single BBC bulletin. He could not. His calculations kept coming back to the same problem. If you needed tons of uranium-235, as he had believed since 1940, then no plausible enrichment plan could have produced the material in 3 years. Something had to give. He proposed at various times that the Americans must have found some miraculous new separation method, that the Hiroshima bomb might not have been uranium at all, that they must have used plutonium bred from a reactor, though he could not see how they had scaled up the production. He did not know yet that both weapons existed, that Hiroshima had been a uranium gun-type device called Little Boy, that a plutonium implosion design was still waiting in a bomb bay on the island of Tinian for its own city. He never questioned the number that had shaped 6 years of his life. Down the hall, Diebner and Hartek argued in the corner about enrichment methods, gaseous diffusion, centrifuges, electromagnetic separation. They understood, in principle, that the Americans must have used more than one method in parallel. They could not imagine the industrial scale that Oak Ridge represented. They were arguing about the wrong problem. The problem was not how the Americans had separated the uranium. The problem was that Heisenberg had told them, for 6 years, that they needed vastly more of it than they actually did. On the 9th of August, the second bomb fell. The BBC announced it that evening. Nagasaki, a different design, a plutonium implosion device. There was no denial this time. Gerlach did not leave his room for most of the day. When Weizsäcker went up to check on him, he found the old physicist sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the garden. He was not weeping now. He looked, Weizsäcker said later, like a general who had lost a battle in which every one of his soldiers had died. Gerlach spoke of honour, of what he had promised Speer, of what he owed to the men who had worked under him for 6 years. Some of them had died in Allied bombing raids and would never know how it had ended. He did not speak of suicide, but Weizsäcker was worried enough that he stayed with him for several hours. For 5 more days, the men of Farm Hall talked about physics. They argued. They calculated. They wrote out equations on the backs of envelopes. And then, on the evening of the 14th of August, Werner Heisenberg gave a lecture. He gathered the others in the drawing room. He stood at the small blackboard the British had provided. He said in a voice quieter than his usual lecturing voice that he had been thinking about the American bomb. He said he wanted to explain, as clearly as he could, how it must have worked. For the next 2 hours, he lectured on the physics of a nuclear weapon. He spoke about neutron mean-free paths, about fast neutron chain reactions, about the geometry of a critical assembly, about the difference between the diffusion problem, which is what you solve for a reactor, and the random walk problem, which is what you solve for a bomb. And this time, working with the same paper and the same pencil he had used all week, he arrived at the correct answer. The critical mass of uranium-235 for a sphere surrounded by a Newton-Rot reflector was on the order of a few dozen kilograms. Not tons, kilograms. He had done the calculation correctly in 8 days. He had not done it correctly in 6 years of war. In the drawing room, no one moved. Otto Hahn was seated near the front. He had a small notebook open on his knee. He wrote nothing. He kept his eyes down on the blank page. Walther Gerlach sat with his eyes closed. Kurt Diebner watched Heisenberg the way a man watches a courtroom. And Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, the one who had begun the story at breakfast a week before, sat very still in the back of the room. He understood, before anyone else, what Heisenberg had just done. The Lesart said. The German scientists had held themselves back for moral reasons. The Lesart said the failure had been a triumph of conscience. But the lecture Heisenberg had just given proved something else. If a lone man with pencil and paper, in 8 days, in an English country house, could arrive at the correct critical mass of uranium-235, then there had never been any technical mystery to shelter behind. The bomb had been buildable all along. They had simply been wrong. For 6 years. About the most important number in nuclear physics. The failure was not moral. It was not noble. It was a mistake at a chalkboard, made in 1940, and never corrected. When the lecture ended, Heisenberg set down the chalk. There was a long silence. He had, without saying so, delivered a verdict on his own scientific career, on the entire WWII, on every young physicist who had worked under him, on every reactor experiment, on every argument he had made to Speer, to the weapons office, to the leadership of the Reich. The men filed out of the drawing room without speaking. That evening in the walled garden, in the last light of a summer day, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker walked slowly along the gravel path with Karl Wirtz. The microphones did not reach the garden. We do not know exactly what they said. We know only what happened in the days that followed. The Lesart did not fall. It grew stronger. The story was retold at meals. It was refined in the parlour. It was written into letters home that would eventually be delivered. It was rehearsed against the eventual questions of journalists, of biographers, of a Germany that would need, in the ruins of the coming decade, to believe that its scientists had been better than its soldiers. The lecture had been the moment for honesty. The moment passed. Hahn refused to join the story. He said, more than once, and the microphones captured him saying it, that they had failed because they had not been good enough, not because they had been noble. Max von Laue, 65 years old, the Nobel laureate, who had never joined the atomic program and had opposed the Nazis openly through 12 years of dictatorship, said almost nothing. He watched. He listened. He made his own private notes. 14 years later, in a letter written in 1959, he would write quietly and without heat that the story the group had told after the war was not what he had heard at Farm Hall. He would say that history was being rewritten in front of his eyes. Diebner said nothing at all. He was a party member. He knew what he was going to face when he returned to Germany. He had no story to sell. The days grew shorter. The English summer began to end. The men waited to hear what their captors would do with them. On the 15th of August, the radio told them that Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Otto Hahn, in the drawing room, said quietly, "Thank God we didn't have it." Nobody argued. Not that night. 3 months later, on the 17th of November, a British soldier walked into the drawing room with a folded newspaper under his arm. He set it on the table beside Otto Hahn. It was the Daily Telegraph, dated that morning. On an inside page, a small paragraph announced that the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences had awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry to Professor Otto Hahn of Berlin for his discovery of the fission of heavy atomic nuclei. The prize was for the year 1944. It had been withheld a year because of the war. Hahn read the paragraph. Then he read it again. He did not smile. The others gathered around him. Heisenberg congratulated him formally, the way a colleague congratulates another colleague. He stepped back and let the older man sit with what he had been given. Weizsäcker was quiet. Von Laue, who had won his own Nobel Prize in Physics in 1914 and understood exactly what this was, watched Hahn's face and did not speak. It was the highest honor a chemist could receive. It was also, in its way, a verdict. The Swedish Academy had given him the prize for the discovery that had made Hiroshima possible. He was sitting in an English prison, in his 66th year, receiving the news from a soldier, delivering a day-old newspaper. He was not permitted to travel to Stockholm. He would not stand before the King of Sweden. He would not give the traditional lecture. He would not sit at the banquet and Lise Meitner, the woman who had done the calculation that made his discovery make sense, the woman who had given fission its name, the woman who had spent 30 years working beside him at the bench in Berlin, the woman who had fled Germany with 10 marks in her purse, was not on the citation. She was mentioned nowhere. She would live another 23 years. She would be nominated for the Nobel Prize 48 times, in physics and in chemistry, and she would never receive one. She would die in Cambridge, England, in October of 1968. The element with atomic number 109 would eventually be named meitnerium in her honor, but only in 1997, decades after she was gone. That afternoon at Farm Hall, Otto Hahn took the newspaper into the garden. He walked alone among the roses. He came back inside after an hour. He did not speak of it for the rest of the day. And in a small room elsewhere in the house, a British officer changed the tape reel and threaded a new one and pressed the button that started it turning again. Through the last weeks of 1945, another conversation began to move underneath the surface of Farm Hall. It was a conversation the men had been putting off since the 9th of August. It concerned a train journey Werner Heisenberg had made 4 years earlier, in September of 1941, to occupied Denmark. He had gone to visit Niels Bohr. Bohr had been his teacher, his mentor, the man who in the 1920s in Copenhagen had helped Heisenberg develop the ideas that had won him the Nobel Prize. Bohr was half Jewish. His mother had been born Jewish. In 1941, he was living in occupied Denmark, under the eyes of the Gestapo. Heisenberg had gone to Copenhagen. He had walked with Bohr in the garden of the Bohr Institute. And whatever he had said to Bohr, whatever Bohr had understood him to say, had ended their friendship. Bohr came away from that meeting, shaken, angry, convinced that his former student had crossed into territory he could not follow. For the rest of Bohr's life, the two men would never truly speak again. At Farm Hall, in the autumn of 1945, Heisenberg spoke about the Copenhagen meeting several times. The microphones caught him. He described the trip as a moral gesture. He said he had gone to Copenhagen to feel out whether both sides of the war were pursuing atomic weapons, to suggest, delicately, that scientists on both sides might quietly agree not to build them. He described himself as a man of conscience trying, at great personal risk, to find a way to prevent the catastrophe that had now, at last, arrived at Hiroshima. He believed his own version. Or, if he did not entirely believe it, he told it consistently. And he told it well. 21 years later, in 1957, an Austrian journalist named Robert Jungk would publish a book called Brighter Than a Thousand Suns. In it, Heisenberg's version of Copenhagen would appear in print. It would enter the historical record. It would form the basis of a play written by Michael Frayn in 1998, which would run in London and New York and win awards. But that is a story for another decade. On the 3rd of January, 1946, the gates of Farm Hall opened. 10 men were told to pack. They were told that they would be returned to the British zone of occupation in Germany. They were told they were free. They were not prosecuted. They were not tried. They were not even publicly named. Kurt Diebner, the party member, was quietly denazified in the years that followed and returned to physics work. Walther Gerlach, who had coordinated the failed atomic program under Speer, resumed his professorship in Munich. The others slipped back into the post-war German scientific community as if they had never been away. Otto Hahn was elected president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society on the 1st of April, 1946, less than 3 months after his release, when the society was renamed the Max Planck Society. On the 26th of February, 1948, he continued as its founding president. He held the position until the 22nd of March, 1960, 12 years. He devoted the rest of his life to arguing publicly against nuclear weapons. He signed petitions. He gave lectures. He warned. In April of 1957, he was one of 18 German nuclear scientists who published the Göttingen Manifesto, publicly refusing to have any part in the development of tactical nuclear weapons for the West German Bundeswehr. He was 78 years old. He never fully set the weight down. Werner Heisenberg became the director of the Max Planck Institute for Physics, first at Göttingen, then in Munich. He built West German theoretical physics almost single-handedly. He was received abroad as a great man of science. He never publicly corrected the Lesart. In a private letter he sent to Robert Jungk in 1957, after Brighter Than 1,000 Suns was published, he told Jungk that some of Jungk's portrait had been overstated, that he had not been quite the moral hero the book made him. He did not say so in public. He died in Munich on the 1st of February, 1976. He was 74 years old. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker outlived them all. He left physics for philosophy. He wrote a great many books about the ethical responsibilities of scientists. He was publicly the model of the reflective German scientist, coming to terms with the 20th century. He never disowned the story he had told at breakfast on the 7th of August, 1945. He died on the 28th of April, 2007. He was 94. Max von Laue, who had watched everything and said very little, died on the 24th of April, 1960, from injuries suffered in a car accident 16 days earlier. He was 80. The private letter he wrote in 1959, in which he said the post-war story was not what he had heard at Farm Hall, would not be widely quoted for another 30 years. Samuel Gaudsmit, the American scientific director of Alsos, wrote a book against the Lesart in 1947. He called it, simply, Alsos. In it, he said plainly that the Germans had failed because they had not been good enough. His book was read by scientists. It was not read by the public. He died in 1978. He was 76 years old. He never got his mother back. He never learned to speak of his father. He carried Auschwitz with him to the end. And the audience that most needed to hear him never did. For 47 years after Farm Hall, the Lesart held the version of the story told by Heisenberg and Weizsäcker, that the German scientists could have built the bomb, that they had chosen, for moral reasons, not to succeed. That failure was a quiet triumph of conscience. It became the dominant version in the West. It appeared in textbooks. It appeared in popular histories. It shaped the way an entire post-war generation understood the German atomic program. The recordings from Farm Hall stayed classified. The British government kept them sealed, decade after decade. The reasons varied. In the 1950s, they were kept classified to protect West German sensibilities during the Cold War. In the 1960s, to avoid embarrassing living scientists. In the 1970s, out of bureaucratic habit. In the 1980s, because there was no political reason to release them. 2 men and 1 woman, however, were about to receive an honor that would bring the whole story briefly back into the light. In October of 1966, in a ceremony at the Atomic Energy Commission in Germantown, Maryland, The government of the United States awarded the Enrico Fermi Award to 3 people, jointly, for the discovery of nuclear fission, to Otto Hahn, to Fritz Strassmann, and to Lise Meitner. It was the first time in 28 years since the December afternoon in Berlin, when Hahn and Strassmann had first found the impossible barium in their laboratory notebook, that all 3 of them had been honoured together. Meitner was 87 years old. She was too frail to travel to America. She received the award through a representative at Cambridge. Hahn was 87 as well. He was too frail to travel. He received the award in West Germany. The 2 of them had worked side by side at a laboratory bench in Berlin for 30 years. Since her flight from Germany in 1938, they had corresponded, but they had spent very little time together. In their 87th year on the same day, half a world apart, they received the same honour. They would not meet again. Otto Hahn died on the 28th of July 1968 in Göttingen. He was 89 years old. Lise Meitner died on the 27th of October 1968 in Cambridge, England. She was 89 as well. She survived him by 3 months. Her family buried her in a country churchyard in Bramley, in Hampshire. On the small grey stone that marks her grave, her nephew Otto Frisch chose an inscription in English. It reads, Lise Meitner, a physicist who never lost her humanity. The element with atomic number 109 would be named Meitnerium in her honour. But that would not happen until 1997, 29 years after her death. By then, another door had opened. In February of 1992, the British Ministry of Defence declassified the Farm Hall transcripts. By then, Werner Heisenberg had been dead for 16 years. Otto Hahn had been dead for 24. Gerlach, Diebner, von Lauer, all of them gone. Of the 10 men who had sat in that drawing room in the summer of 1985, only one was still alive, to answer for the words the microphones had caught. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker was 79 years old when the transcripts were released. He read them. He was interviewed. He did not retract the story he had told. He said, in essence, that the transcripts were being misread, that the mood of that summer could not be fully recovered from words on a page, that his generation had done what it could with what it had. He carried the story to his grave. But there was one more room in the house of that story, and in February of 2002, 10 years after the Farm Hall transcripts came into the light, the door to that room opened as well. The Niels Bohr Archive in Copenhagen had planned to release the private papers of Niels Bohr in the year 2012. That was the date the family had set. But in early 2002, the family made a decision. The Michael Frayn play, Copenhagen, had by then been performed on stages in London and New York and Berlin and Frankfurt. Millions of people had seen it. Millions of people had read Robert Junk's book. Millions of people believed the story Werner Heisenberg had told for the last 30 years of his life. Bohr's family concluded that 10 more years of silence would allow that story to harden into history. On the 6th of February 2002, the Niels Bohr Archive released, 10 years ahead of schedule, a set of letters that Bohr had written but had never sent. Drafts. Some of them dated from the 1950s, some from the 1960s, all of them addressed to Werner Heisenberg, all of them concerning the meeting in Copenhagen in September of 1941. The picture that emerged from those letters was very different from the story Heisenberg had told at Farm Hall. In Bohr's memory, Heisenberg had come to Copenhagen confident that Germany was going to win the war. He had spoken of atomic weapons not as a horror to be avoided, but as a technical inevitability. He had implied that Bohr should reconcile himself to German victory, that Danish and other European scientists might have a role to play in the new order. There had been no warning. There had been no offered agreement. There had been no gesture of conscience. There had been, in Bohr's memory, a soft attempt at recruitment. Bohr had chosen, for the rest of his life, not to send those letters. He had chosen to protect the friendship, or the memory of the friendship. Or perhaps, simply to spare Heisenberg something worse than silence. He had made that choice, quietly, over 40 years. Heisenberg was not there to see the letters released. He had died in 1976. still telling his version. There is a house in Godmanchester, 17 miles north of Cambridge. It is a private residence today. There is no plaque on its wall. There is no sign at the road. Tourists do not stop there. The garden where Otto Hahn walked alone among the roses in the summer of 1945 is now the kitchen view of somebody else's family. The walls that once held microphones are just walls. If you drive past on a summer evening and the light is long and golden, the way it was on the 6th of August, 1945, you will see nothing to suggest what happened there. You will see an English country house. You will see ivy on the brick. You will see a garden. The question the recordings finally answered, if we are honest with ourselves, is not whether the German scientists were heroes or monsters. They were neither. They were competent men who had failed at a specific technical problem, because one of them, at a critical moment in 1940, had used the wrong mathematical method and had never gone back to check. They were educated men who had, in most cases, remained inside a criminal regime for 12 years, doing the work that regime asked them to do, and telling themselves that science was above politics. They were ordinary men who, when the news came in from a Japanese city they had never seen, reacted the way ordinary men react to catastrophe. Some wept, some denied. Some began, almost immediately, to construct the story they would tell. They were not the last men to do any of those things. If Werner Heisenberg had done the calculation correctly in 1940. If he had gone to Speer in 1942 and said that a bomb was buildable within 3 years. If Speer had gone to Hitler with that answer. What then? The honest answer is that we do not know. Germany lacked uranium. It lacked electrical capacity for enrichment on the American scale. It lacked, by 1942, the industrial security that a Manhattan Project would have required. The Allied bombing campaign would have arrived over the enrichment plants. Soviet armies would have arrived over the reactors. It is very possible that Germany would have failed anyway. It is also possible that Germany would not have failed. It is possible that the calculation Heisenberg finally did, in 8 days at Farm Hall, if he had done it in 1940, would have changed the course of the 20th century. It is possible that the difference between a world in which Adolf Hitler had an atomic bomb in 1944 and the world we actually live in is one mathematical error made by one exhausted man at a chalkboard, in a laboratory in Leipzig, in a season none of us will ever see. We do not know. We will never know. What we do know is this. On the evening of the 6th of August, 1945, 10 German scientists sat in an English country house and listened to a BBC announcement, in the minutes and hours that followed. Before any of them had the time to think carefully about how they would explain themselves to history, they spoke honestly into microphones they did not know were there. They said that they were shocked, that they did not believe it, that perhaps it was propaganda, that perhaps the Americans had used plutonium, that they were, on some level they were still trying to understand, relieved. Otto Hahn, 66 years old, said the words no one in the world was ever meant to hear, that he felt personally responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. He was, in his way, telling the truth. Not the whole truth of what had happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945. Not the whole truth of what the Uhrenwähren had been and had not been. The truth of one moment, of one man, of one evening in a strange country far from home. The rest of the story, the moral story, the noble story, the story of scientists who chose conscience over duty, would be built later. It would be built in the drawing room of Farm Hall in the days after August 6th. It would be built in the post-war books and interviews and lectures. It would be built patiently, decade after decade, in the absence of the recordings that could refute it. And then, in February of 1992, the recordings came out. And the story at last met the sound of the men who had actually lived through that evening. Their voices, their arguments, their silences. They had not been heroes. They had not been monsters. They had been 10 men in a country house in the last summer of a war they had already lost, learning that the world had changed without them, and beginning, before the sun rose, to decide what they would say about it. They said many things. Not all of them were true. But the microphones remembered everything.